Hi everyone. On this week's episode, Andrew and I talk to academic and activist Thea Riofrancos, Associate Professor of Political Science at Providence College in Rhode Island. And we're going to be talking about myriad contradictions of so-called green capitalism. Hope you enjoy it.
Hello and welcome. My name is Lucy Burke and this is the Green New Deal podcast brought to you by Green New Deal Media on a really cold and rainy night in December in Manchester. I'm joined as ever by producer extraordinaire Andrew Glassford, who is not feeling cynical or miserable or jaded at all this evening. Are you, Andrew?
It feels a bit disingenuous to just call me producer extraordinaire, where I'm sat here with one of the lead negotiators for the University and Colleges Union and one of the best motherfucking trade unionists in Manchester. So let's big up Lucy as opposed to me, who just turns knobs and whistles. But I'm feeling very well, part of that. Thank you, Lucy.
Really appreciate that. I'm not a negotiator this year, but I am on the Climate and Ecological Emergency Committee of the union that's just been set up, and we're talking about integrating Green New Deal bargaining into our pay talks, and so all of that is a positive despite the generally apocalyptic things that are going on in the world around us. So yeah, thanks Andrew for all of that.
We go again, as they say.
Yeah. So our guest this week is academic and activist Thea Riofrancos, who is Professor of Political Science at Providence College in Rhode Island and a member of the Climate and Community Project. Thea has published widely on a range of climate-related issues and particularly resource politics. Her forthcoming book, Extraction: The Frontiers of Green Capitalism, explores the rapidly emerging global lithium industry and some of the myriad contradictions of so-called green capitalism, not least the environmentally devastating practices that underpin the extraction of lithium, the element required to produce the batteries essential to green economies, from electric vehicles to wind and solar energy storage. And regular listeners to the podcast will remember that we ran an episode on this, exploring the impact of lithium extraction in Congo and the kind of much darker side of the production of electric vehicles. So Thea, welcome to the show. It's great to have you on. And perhaps you could start by telling us something about how, when and where you became interested in the climate emergency and in the Green New Deal.
Yeah, so thank you so much for having me. And that's a good way to start, because it's a little bit circuitous, though I won't take you through my whole biography. But I guess that suffice to say, it's really kind of actually the Green New Deal itself that helped me become a climate activist in a way, right? I mean, meaning like for a long, yeah, it is. And so the timing lines up very neatly with the launch of the Green New Deal congressional resolution in the US and sort of the mobilization of the Sunrise Movement and also DSA and other groups and movements around the Green New Deal concept. But to backtrack maybe a little bit, for 13 years now, maybe a little bit more, dating myself, I've been very interested academically as well as the kind of activist in solidarity with in the environmental and social harms caused by mining and other types of extractive projects in Latin America. So that's what I've worked on academically as well as doing kind of solidarity work around that point. And I didn't myself actually connect that to climate change in my head or even in sort of my published work on the matter at an earlier stage. And my book, Resource Radicals, which covers those topics, again, doesn't really center climate. It's more about, on the one hand, kind of localized environmental and social harm of resource extraction, and also the kind of tricky political economy issues of resource dependency in the global South, right? One reason I didn't think of myself as someone that worked on climate, even though we all do, whether directly or indirectly, is that the activists that I was tracking in Latin America did not primarily center climate in their kind of grievances and demands. It was much more about, as I said, kind of, violations of indigenous rights, pollution of the watershed, those sorts of things, right? And it was through actually getting involved in various collaborations with people that became my co-authors and comrades and fellow activists on the Green New Deal topic, that we eventually co-authored the book, A Planet to Win, that I started to understand the connections between extraction and extractivism and the climate crisis, right? And also at the same time, let's say anti-extractive activists fighting specific mining projects also began, I think, increasingly to incorporate the kind of planetary scale of the harm. It was also, I think, choosing a research topic of lithium mining that combines the dimensions of resource extraction, climate change, and the necessity for a rapid energy transition kind of into one conflictual bundle that I think, again, further clarified for me the kind of back and forth relationship between extraction and climate change.
I love the idea of a conflictual bundle. I think that's a very nice way to
I don't know how that metaphor
actually.
Really works, but
it feels kind of dialectical in its sense,
Yeah.
but it's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
It would be great, actually, probably to start to identify some of those conflicts, I think, in terms of identifying where the tensions are, because I think it's really interesting thinking about those tensions as ones that occur with, on the left and between different people on the left as well, as part of the additional sort of set of challenges we might have.
When I'm thinking about how I arrived at these conflicts and contradictions, as I kind of just started to say, like, I became really enamored in a way with the Green New Deal idea, with its kind of holistic nature, interconnecting different struggles, different visions and demands and grievances kind of into a very holistic paradigm of transformation that addresses the climate crisis at scale, but while also, of course, addressing a lot of other issues of threats to material well-being that working class communities around the world are feeling right now, right? And so, I lean into that paradigm completely. But what I started to feel in my own work and my own self, in a way, not to get like too navel gazing about it, like this tension, which is like, I'm a big proponent of the Green New Deal, but then when I go to Latin America and look at what these supply chains look like on the ground, look at the sites of extraction that are kind of the beginning of the production of the green technologies that I'm advocating to be mass deployed, within, let's say, the United States, it inevitably kind of tore me apart a bit. Like, is what I'm advocating for in terms of Green New Deal domestically, if we want to talk in those terms in the US, going to cause harm or displace harm elsewhere or cause externalities elsewhere? That kind of is more of the same for, over 500 years of a colonial and then neo-colonial kind of world order, right? And so I felt torn between those two things, which is what first prompted me to think about, is there a different way to design and implement and envision the energy transition that at the very least minimizes those harms related to resource extraction, but maybe more ambitiously thinks about kind of non-extractive relationships between humans and nature, and thinks about non-extractive and circular ways to actually redesign the economy itself, right? That would be most ambitious. But I think there's also just a lot of basic harm reduction that needs to happen in terms of preventing the reproduction of the worst forms and most rapacious forms of extraction, as we necessarily advocate for an urgent energy transition. I think what drives this home for me is that I think that we, and I hate to use that term, and we problematize the we a lot, of course, in the climate justice movement, but like, let's just say for now, to be simplistic, like, we are moving much too slowly on climate action, right? We're moving much too slowly on the renewable energy transition, as much as kind of Silicon Valley and maybe finance types are saying, we're getting all this investment in these technologies. That's great, but we're not doing it in a way that's actually displacing fossil fuel use, right? And so this is we're moving too slowly, right? That's just like a full stop. But, moving very quickly without intentionality and kind of thought to what the kind of whole set of extractive and productive processes that are required to produce the technologies that are needed to harness renewable energy, without being thoughtful about that, moving quickly, in some ways, in some contexts, could also be harmful, right? And so that feels like, where that inner conflict gets the most tense for me. It's when I think about speed and scale, which are exactly what I think are important about a Green New Deal framework, because it says we need to move quickly, we need to move at scale. Those are some hallmarks of the Green New Deal compared to like carbon pricing, which like doesn't think about any of those types of things, right?
Yeah.
But on the other hand, like, speed and scale could run roughshod over local ecosystems or communities that happen to be sort of caught in a way in the crossfire of where the more toxic parts of supply chains hit the ground.
Yeah, because like I suppose for some of these kind of areas are almost like new frontiers for capital as well to find, profit and extraction. We spoke to Chris Armstrong last year, or was it even this year even, about his book, The Blue New Deal, which was talking about like kind of dealing with deep sea mining and who owns those lands. And actually there is very much a race on right now at like the UN's like maritime organization, defining who owns those pieces of land under the water and who gets a share of the wealth built off that land. And I suppose this is kind of playing out across the entirety of, like, I suppose the green sectors, whatever they are, wherever they be, tree planting somewhere in Manchester versus, extracting lithium in Ecuador or Venezuela. So it's almost like, I suppose for me, the Green New Deal is like trying to draw all of that into the arguments we're already having about capitalism entirely and say the internationalism we had previously now has a time limit on it as well, which kind of maybe spikes my cynicism. So I was saying at the top of the show.
Yeah, I think that just to answer that briefly, or sort of expand on that, because I think it's a great point. I mean, one of the ways that I've sort of, there's a couple of ways I sort of provisionally, and I emphasize that term, resolve these contradictions, at least to enable me to like do the work I do, right? So I'm not like stalled or paralyzed, because I think that's like even a familiar feeling with working on climate change in general is the paralysis and the anxiety and those types of things. If we could sort of distill the Green New Deal into a set of principles or values or orientations, right? Rather than the policies, but almost more just like it's a way of looking at the world, right? Like what happens if we expand that internationally, or we apply that to the supply chains that produce the technologies that we want to deploy at a mass scale? What does it do to our conception of even the policies that we might advocate for in the US if we take the Green New Deal to be like a fully global proposition, right? Like, what does the Green New Deal mean for a community affected by potentially lithium mining in Chile, right? So that's one way. And another way, which I'll just kind of be briefer about, because maybe we'll get to it later, maybe we won't, is to think again intentionally about how to reduce the material throughput required to have a flourishing climate safe life, right?
Thinking through this, I mean, I suppose there are tensions as well, aren't there? And this is what we picked up when we were talking about what's happening in Congo is, the fact that the surplus value is all going elsewhere. None of it is staying put. But there are tensions, aren't there, between the kind of the idea of the nation state, the idea of the kind of a kind of multinational capitalism, the idea of internationalism, legitimate drives for self-determination. Outside of those circuits as well. So there's a lot to unpick, isn't there? And I wondered if you could say a little bit more about that in the context of sort of Central and South America, and particularly kind of the context of, the shift, that moment of kind of brief hope, around another kind of leftward shift there.
Yes, exactly.
And you're oil in Venezuela as well. I mean, it's complicated, right?
Absolutely. And you're hitting on something very important about extractive sectors, which in general, and this is mining and fossil fuels. But extractive sectors are interesting, to use, I guess, a neutral term, in part because there's so many problems. Like there's so many distinct reasons that communities, workers, national bureaucrats, like, scientists, regulators, all sorts of constituencies, let's say in a Latin American context, indigenous communities, right? Campesinos, small farmer communities, like there's so many different reasons that these constituencies and communities might target extractive sectors for needing, at the very least fundamental reform, if not fuller transformation or opposition to court, right? And the reason I frame it that way is because, on the one hand, there's a really long tradition, and it's actually just over 100 years old, of what we might call resource nationalism in Latin America. This tradition really took form in like starting in the 1920s, though it had, you know, even bigger moments in the 60s and 70s and sort of onward. And then most recently with the left tide governments during the pink tide, and even the current left sort of pink tide 2 kind of government. So there's this abiding tradition of like, we should be sovereign over our resources, right? And that makes complete sense if like you're relegated to the periphery of the world system and you have limited national control over the most essential and strategic sector of your economy, right? And there are all sorts of other reasons, ranging from political corruption, you know, to kind of underpayment of basic royalties and taxes, that governments may want to exert more control over multinational extractive firms. So that's kind of one line of critique and set of positive proposals. And then a very different line of critique and set of proposals, it generated kind of more recently, we could maybe date it to the 90s, but really it's been kind of the early 2000s onward, that says like, we need, you know, to really rethink and maybe even abolish these sectors, right? Like like indigenous communities whose land is dispossessed and polluted, you know, radical environmental activists that point also to the large scale contamination and just the lack of respect for human and non-human nature, right? And the sort of whole socio-natural kind of life worlds of the places that extraction unfolds. Like, that's a different critique, you know, honing in on the ecological and social devastation of extraction. And that might be actually relatively agnostic about who owns it, because the problem is the extraction and the scale of it and the industrial quality of it, and its linkages also to a world system that, even if it's a state-owned company, like the copper might be leaving to sort of enter into these supply chains, right? And so those are different critiques, and they're not only different, they also can be in opposition to one another, right? And so one of the things I wrote about a lot in Resource Radicals, but it, you know, continues to be an issue in that book focused on Ecuador, but it's an issue around the region, is that there can even be conflicts between like left-wing governments that want resource sovereignty, kind of tapping into that older tradition of leftism, and then indigenous and ecological movements that actually want an end or a phasing out of extraction altogether, right? And so while these both issue from kind of leftist principles and critiques of capitalism and imperialism, they cash out those critiques in really different ways, right? And so kind of attending, you know, we were listing tensions earlier. Like, this is actually one of my original tensions that I focus a lot on in my work, is between these two kind of these two critiques of extraction and what their attending kind of political strategies might be.
In terms of Ecuador, that's going to kind of follow into like talking about resource radicals a bit. How does that play out kind of in the local politics in those areas around those mines?
Ecuador kind of stands out regionally, though again you have versions of this around the continent, and beyond the continent, around the all of Latin America, including in Central America, and the Caribbean. But regardless, like in Ecuador, it kind of stands out for being a place where communities have taken a pretty oppositional stance towards extraction. Now, right away, I'm simplifying, I'm homogenizing a bit. In any community, there are going to be people that don't care, that are apathetic, or that want the extraction for the jobs, right? And we know that extraction tends to be very locally divisive, but that's like all the more reason that it's interesting that a lot of communities and local community groups and social movements, indigenous and environmental and small farmer, have taken like an increasingly oppositional stance and been able to rally a lot of the community behind that. And so that, you know, in Ecuador, what's the sort of concrete implication of that, you're asking, is that, you know, there are projects that just have, you know, even sometimes after over a decade, or even in some cases decades of attempts to explore and invest in them and bring them into operation, like, have just been stalled. And in some cases, legal battles have been won out of those, you know, more grassroots social movements. They've taken legal form with referenda or lawsuits or things like that, which have actually put now legal limits, right? So it's, you know, there's it may be that for, you know, many years it's just like a grassroots kind of land and water defense type thing. But then if you get a local or even national, in some cases, referendum, or you win a national court case, like, you might get legal backing for this anti-extraction position, and then it's very difficult for investment to move forward. Now, I don't want to sound like Ecuador is now like an ecological utopia. It's a petrostate, meaning like oil is like the basis of a lot of the economy, and especially the sort of you know, general budget of the government. And there are major large scale mining projects that have proceeded, but there are several that haven't proceeded, right? And that is like an outcome that's worth exploring in and of itself.
So one of the big issues in in the UK, and obviously we're talking about a really, really different context, is what happens to communities that are built around particular kinds of industrial practices, for instance, mining. What happens or oil potentially as well, and what happens when that stops? And you seem to be, and the impact of that on communities, because when coal mines closed in the 1980s, in this continue to close, it kind of absolutely decimates the community, and has really significant, the kind of harms that you're talking about. You seem to be talking about a slightly different scenario, but I'm just wondering about the role of kind of trade unions as well in the context that you're talking about, whether or not there is a kind of strong trade union movement that it also plays a part in some of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for bringing in labor and also bringing in these issues of post-extractive transitions that are not well planned from the community perspective, such that we get loss of livelihood, social fabric, and that feeds into a number of other forms of social dislocation. And obviously, the UK, from Margaret Thatcher's intentional closing of coal mines in order to weaken the National Mining Union, is one great tragic but excellent example of what you're talking about. And we have similar processes in Appalachia in the US, and around, South Africa is grappling with what would a transition look like. But so we could go around the world with this issue. So you're astutely noting the distinction, and I'll just even make it more explicit, which is that in Ecuador and actually Andrew used the term frontier earlier. So a lot of what I've looked at in my research is places where new mining is being proposed, right? So the question is less, what will happen to workers already employed in a mining project, and more what will happen to the non-mining livelihoods that mining might displace, right? So it's a kind of inverted version of this, right? So if you're a farmer or you work in ecotourism, or just even throw out a kind of weird example that might not occur to us, in Argentina, there have been several provinces and municipalities that have banned mining or attempted to ban mining because it would affect the wine industry, right? I mean, so there can be kind of incumbent industries, sometimes with some power, or there can just be meaningful livelihoods, like subsistence farming, right, that may be threatened by mining. And so it's a different problem than one of the sort of a post-extractive transition. It's more trying to prevent it before it begins. And in those contexts is precisely where we tend to see, and again, I don't want to generalize too much, but where we tend to see more radical critiques of extraction, because the choice between either the status quo or something better than the status quo, even more ecologically sound, and a future of mining is a very stark choice, right? Whereas if you're already have a mining economy, a host of other questions are raised, right? About, and so I just want to make that distinction clear, because that's especially in Ecuador, and also in my current work on lithium, when I go to Nevada or Portugal, I mean, just like Cornwall in the UK, these are projects that have not yet started, right? And so the choice of, do we want to go down the path of extraction or not, feels existential. I want to just quickly, though, Lucy, answer your question about unions, because despite everything I just said, they're relevant to this story and to some of the topics that we've already brought up. In Ecuador, at a kind of earlier stage of the politics of extraction, in the 80s and 90s. So this is me drawing on sort of archival and secondary work, not stuff that I directly observed. But anyway, the Oil Workers Union has been extremely involved in fighting a different battle, which is the neoliberal privatization or attempted neoliberalization of the oil sector, which was a more state-owned sector, but has been chipped away at in various ways, right? And so they took on a huge role in articulating a very militant version of resource nationalism, which sometimes can be a kind of more technocratic, the state should own things, but they were the workers should own it. This is the lifeblood of popular sovereignty, these very more radical versions of resource nationalism. And so the Oil Workers Union was extremely important in articulating those. And then, then we can get into how there was this shift towards even more kind of ecological and indigenous rights-based framing of the critique of extraction. But they're part of that story, and they're part of other aspects of the story globally as well.
Just to kind of follow up on that position from them, do they deal with the idea of climate change in that argument, or is it kind of based on the kind of more like, I suppose, traditionally left wing thing, like we do the work, we should own it. It's our the fruits of our own labor, and everything else is not quite as important, as to put it in a very blunt way. Like how does that like, is there, if you know much about it, is there like, is there infighting amongst the oil workers as well about this?
Yeah, so I don't know now. And when I was the work that I was doing on the oil workers union was related to their activities in the 90s and early 2000s, when there were major attempts to kind of neoliberalize the oil sector in Ecuador, and those attempts were partly frustrated. Some of them worked, some of them didn't, but the oil workers were a major political force. In fact, they were very forcibly repressed by various governments because of how potent they were. Again, kind of an interesting parallel with the mine workers in the UK being such a potent political force, and why they needed to be kind of like neutralized from the Thatcher government perspective. But I think that there are interesting contemporary examples, and I'll leave Ecuador just because I don't know about what the oil workers union is saying right now about climate change. But I think that there are a lot of interesting examples of the world of workers in extractive industries, including in the fossil fuels, like starting to think through how to integrate the reality of an energy transition, and rather than to sort of be on the defense, like we want to protect our fossil fuel jobs at all costs, to actually say, well, we should be a part of this transition, because otherwise the transition won't be just, right? And I know this is stuff you've talked about, I'm sure, on like 1,000 other podcasts and work on yourselves, but
we'll keep saying it until it happens.
Yeah, exactly. But just to give just to say one example of this recently, there was a very important kind of pivot on the part of the United Mine Workers in the US. So that's similar to what we were just talking about in the UK, like coal workers unions. They embraced a transition, right? Like previously they had not. This was like, I want to say a year ago. It was sort of in the lead up to what became the Inflation Reduction Act negotiations, and they were kind of figuring out where they stood on those issues. I'm pretty sure that's when it was. It was in the past year or two and it was interesting because well, not to get too inside baseball in U.S. politics, but this is in West Virginia. Joe Manchin is the senator there. He's also receives a lot of fossil fuel, lobbyist donations, and he's been a big roadblock in terms of all sorts of climate things. But and he used to kind of, in some ways, count on the United Mine Workers to also be oppositional vis-a-vis the energy transition, but they changed course, right? And I think that was extremely important. And we see more and more unions, not primarily in the fossil fuel world, but throughout, the labor movement in the US, like explicitly kind of leaning into an energy transition with the idea. And the UAW is the best example, of course, the United Auto Workers, because they could easily just say, we want to defend our traditional car jobs, because under the belief that those jobs are more labor intensive, and also just not wanting, thinking that change will be disruptive to whatever, good contracts and pensions that they already have, right? But instead, like, they went on the most militant strike ever and like unionized battery plants and said, like, we want to be in the driver's seat, I guess, pun intended, of this transition, rather than be defensively hanging on to like the incumbent industry as our only hope, right? And so that, we see unions break in different ways on that point, but there's, I think, more to be hopeful about than it, like if we'd had this conversation a few years ago.
I mean, it's so interesting. I think probably in also the expression of a bunch of differences between how the trade union movement operates, say, in the UK, and how it might operate or be able to operate in the States, because it tends to simply be a very reactive, defensive response often here. It means there are tensions between different trade unions in terms of actually what a just transition might look like, and the spaces that people have actually to utilize the knowledge and strength and experience of workers in thinking through alternatives. So there doesn't seem to be that same kind of space often here for people to really actively participate in transforming the ways in which the skills that they've developed in one area might be used in a more environmentally sort of friendly way. And so it's I think there are issues to do with trade union sort of traditions and bureaucracies, and that kind of make it feel like it's more difficult to imagine what you've just described happening actually Yeah.
Yeah, we've had a real revitalization of, and I don't want to overstate, right? So because I can sometimes get too optimistic sounding, and I check myself, just because it's great when good things happen, right? So
Yeah,
it like becomes very exciting to talk about them. But we have had a revitalization, and it's been a long, slow road of years, maybe in some cases decades, of like rank and file trade unionism in the US, right? Of revitalizing the internal democracy, which has a lot of benefits that I don't need to explain, because you, like, I know, are like working in a variety of like working in a trade union yourself, right? And I'm sure you recognize immediately why that's important. But it's been the case that in some cases, at least with the UAW, for 100% certain, that has coincided with, I think, this really generative, galvanizing, and also strategic and savvy approach to the electrification of the auto sector, right? Which is to say, like, we need to be in control of this. Workers need to benefit from it. That's the only way it'll also be politically sustainable, rather than, again, hang on to like the lost world. Instead, it's like, at the same time that they're fighting for better pensions, right? So it's not in a way that they're ignoring what their elder or retired kind of members need. Like, they're trying to weave that together to not be kind of on the sidelines, so to speak. And so, yeah, I think it is, I mean, you mentioned bureaucracy, and I just think that, and I don't want to sound like, because I don't want to get too critical of existing trade union leaders, which are operating under severe constraints and decimated by neoliberalism and all the things, right? But revitalizing that internal democracy, I think, has in many cases gone hand in hand with like a more strategic orientation to the energy transition.
I think it's so interesting right now, actually, thinking about trade unionism in America, is that the kind of very visible activism right now, the fights seem about technology and the use of technology versus about pay and conditions, even though they'll be part of that. So, like the UAW, and then the writers' strikes and the actors' strikes as well. And there is as well this kind of wider feeling that stuff is all about to happen and change very quickly. And as opposed to fighting about, we're going to get an extra 2% on the pound, we should fight about dealing with that bigger change. And maybe that is something in the water that is helping build kind of culturally that unionism in the US as well.
Yeah.
Great. Sorry, that's
I restrain myself,
like,
I could say I could say more, but I'm intentionally not, because you're the host, not me, so you should direct the conversation.
No. Well, no, it's this is a horizontal organization.
Okay, good.
But I wonder if we should maybe kind of on that note pivot to talk about your work around lithium specifically. If we were to try and move transport to electricity next week, just a straight yes no question, would we have enough lithium in the world to do that? And why is that a problem or not?
Okay, so this is the thing that's a little hard to wrap your head around, with mining sectors. And I feel like, again, after studying like these sectors in general for like 13 years now, like it's still like something that even I have to like sit with and just be like, this is the case. Because what is the case is that mining and the supply chains that mining inputs kind of feed into is not primarily about literally what is underground. Right. And that seems counterintuitive, because like we're wresting the stuff from underneath the Earth's crust, or in the case of lithium, there's also kind of other weird sources like these brine pools and even the oceans potentially, right? So anyway, but most mining is kind of terrestrial and involves digging into the earth. We're taking stuff out, and like whatever's there is there, right? Like we know what's there, and there's either enough or there's not, right? And actually none of those are true, in the sense that we don't know what's there in its entirety. So there's an epistemological, not to get too philosophical again, but like an epistemological issue, which is like how much stuff is underground. And, believe it or not, that deposits, which is just the baseline, like stuff we know we can extract, right? It may not be technologically feasible. It may not be profitable. So those are, resources and reserves. Those are other kind of geological categories, but just baseline deposits, like the stuff is there. We know it's there, right? That that grows over time, which is weird. Like, how can there be more stuff? This stuff was made like millennia ago, right? Like, but yet, in deep geological time, it's not that it's literally expanding each day. It's just that our knowledge of it, and also the technological tools we have to survey, and then the technological, like the techniques we have to extract, change over time, such that, like, as the years go on, the amount of lithium underground grows without anything happening, just us discovering more of it, right? And that is itself propelled by the extractive impulses of global capitalism and also the strategic interests of states. So, like, there's all sorts of motives to survey, meaning to, like, explore for new deposits, right? And right now the USGS, our geological kind of state agency, is embarking on a major, I think it's like a 5-year exploration effort to figure out exactly what critical minerals deposits the US has, because we do not know, right? And we're like the most advanced country in the world or whatever it is, right? And, like, think about places that may not have the, like, state capacity to do that surveying, right? And in fact, the USGS does a lot of stuff abroad as well, right? And we could get into that as even sometimes an arm of forms of imperialism, right? Anyway, I'll put that aside. But the point is just that we don't know exactly how much is underground. But what we do know is that there's a lot of lithium underground. It's actually a relatively abundant element, in part because it exists in all these weird forms, like I mentioned, the ocean, super low concentrations, and not economic to use that as a source, at least right now. But it's in hard rocks, it's in brines, it's in even geothermal brines, it's in clay deposits, and it's one of the more abundant elements in the periodic table. But there's a big difference between how much is literally underground, which again, we only know a subset of, but how much is literally underground and how much is available to be used, right? Because, just now we can get into the weird temporality of mining, which is that there's a very long time frame between discovery of a deposit and the mine being fully operational and pumping out the stuff and sending it to global markets, right? And in fact, for 10, 15 years, and those timeframes have extended over time, not gotten for various reasons that if you want to make me more annoyingly wonky and nerdy, I can be. But just for now, I'll just say the timeframes have gotten longer, and including for good reasons like better regulation, rights enforcement, but also for reasons that are not so good, and also the weird intersections of finance as a sector and extraction, and the ways that doesn't actually always gel because they're very different types of capitalism in a way. And so, like, but they need to connect because finance provides the money for the mining to happen, right? And also protest slows down mines in some cases. Again, things that we might think are good developments lead to better governance, rights enforcement, and also things that are not so good. But point being, there's a whole, bundle of, I forget what I use, conflictual bundle, whatever that term was from earlier. There's a whole conflictual bundle of reasons. But mining is longue durée compared to many of the other types of productive processes that we're used to under capitalism. So you can, not that it's easy to retool a traditional auto plant to make it an EV plant, but that's like actually a much easier and time delimited prospect than like bringing a lithium mine online and being totally certain that it's going to pump out lithium and that it's going to be easy to make that sort of battery grade and its quality and all sorts of things. So right now we're, I'm going to just talk from like capitalist perspective, not from like social critic perspective. Like we're at like a pretty good, okay point of like okay-ish market equilibrium with lithium, meaning like there's kind of enough supply in available markets and the contracts that exist to meet the demand. Like a year ago, totally not the case, total disequilibrium. And like there was demand was so far outpacing supply that prices were at historic levels, and that swing is not just like a one-off thing. In general, extractive sectors, because of some of the reasons I just named, tend to be very volatile. Like you don't always have the supply when you need it, and sort of vice versa. Sometimes you get a lot of supply on the market, and then the demand has dissipated by that point, right? So there are these huge market swings that's made worse by financialization. Again, things we could get into, but I'll just name that for now. But even within that broader context, some, close observers of these markets have said like lithium has stood out because it's been really dramatic over the past decade and its highs and lows. And so in terms of whether supply and demand are balancing or whether they're totally out of whack with one another. So is there enough lithium? The answer is yes, geologically, not always economically or in terms of like market supply, which is different than underlying geological supply.
Can you say a bit more about the actual way in which it's mined? So
Yeah, no, it's all great questions. And I just want to actually say one thing, which is an overall kind of statistic, not about lithium in
Yeah.
particular, but this also is counterintuitive because we have a baseline belief that technological progress might make things better. Who knows? I mean, maybe we don't have that belief, but let's just pretend we do, because what would be surprising is that actually those accidents with mining, like those tailings failures, where and for people that are uninitiated, like we're talking about the mix of physical and also liquid waste piles that are contained in dams at any mine site, because you're excavating tons of earth that might be mixed with different chemicals as well that you've used in mining. So it's kind of a gross slurry that often itself has a lot of contaminants in it, right? So anyway, you need to contain that somehow, and it's forever, right? Like it's waste forever, right? And so it needs to be very well contained. Anyway, the failings of those dams where they just breach the dam and the waste kind of just floods the environment, sometimes entering water streams and things like that, those incidents have increased over time, not decreased, increased, right? And there are reasons, again, feel free to ask me why that is. It's not per se because regulation is worse, though it's certainly not good enough. It's partly because the deposits, I guess, just put it really briefly, generate more waste than they used to, because humanity is now mining like lower concentration deposits, because we, all the things the Spanish Empire, I mean, we've been like mining for a long time, right? And a lot of the good deposits have been extracted. And so we're doing those lower concentration deposits, which means we have more waste per like valuable mineral, right? And so that's higher waste piles. Okay. So that's a huge problem the industry has to deal with in every facet of the industry. But with lithium, so I said earlier, lithium's weird. It's an alkali metal. That means it's super reactive. It doesn't exist like as a metal in isolation in nature. It's always glommed on to other elements and compounds, and it takes very heterogeneous forms. So I said earlier, hard rock, clay, brine, geothermal brine, oceans, right? We don't extract from the ocean yet, but the others have been extracted from those types of deposits, and they all imply different impacts and also different extractive techniques, right? So, what I looked at in the beginning of this project was Chile. There, as similar to Argentina, to Bolivia, but also elsewhere in the world, the lithium is in subsurface brine, so like very salty water, actually saltier than the ocean. That's underground of salt flats, and it's pumped out through these wells, kind of like a giant straw sucking it out, and arrayed on these ponds, and then the water evaporates, right? And so the issue there's a lot of issues there, but couple issues there are, and I'm just going to stick with environmental because there's also like social harms that we could talk about, but environmentally, there's a big question, and it's a little hard to answer with certainty because the research is often very biased and influenced by the companies themselves. But the concern that regulators and lots of scientists that I've interviewed, and certainly community members have, is that sucking out the salt water kind of draws down the freshwater aquifers that it interfaces with on the perimeter of the salt flat. And so it's making freshwater less accessible in a place that's the driest desert on Earth, nothing drier than the Atacama Desert in terms of deserts, right? So it's already a water scarce environment. It's made worse due to climate change, and it's also the site of some of the world's biggest copper mines, which are extremely freshwater hungry, right? So it's a lot of compounding and cumulative harm in a lot of extractive landscapes, because often multiple things are extracted, right? And that is not itself governed in any way. There's other effects that we could talk about, like we've seen declining biodiversity near lithium mines. We don't know exactly why that is. It could be noise pollution. I mean, things like that, literally with large scale mining, like scares off species. It could be the lack of water access, right? So there's different mechanisms that could be accounting for that, but we definitely see reduced flamingo populations, very cool flamingos that live on that salt flat. If we go to Australia, Western Australia, the world's #1 actually source of lithium, and that's from hard rock. So then we have those physical waste piles that we were talking about earlier. We also have a much more emissions intensive operation, both in the immediate mining, because you're like breaking rock with basically machinery that works on fossil fuels, right? But you're also shipping pretty unrefined concentrate to China to be further refined. And that itself is very emissions intensive, right? Each site is unique in terms of the harms. And that's not to say, it's infinitely complex, but more that there's like a panorama of distinct harms that are, with lithium even more so than some other elements, like pretty site specific.
Who are the big players in lithium mining? Is it the people that are the big players in like cobalt and copper mining, or like organizations like Glencore? Is lithium and the other kind of rare earth minerals that can be used in EVs? Is it like new organizations that are kind of coming up to jump into it, like with the rest of the green transition?
Yeah, it's a great question because it's kind of both. But
Right.
I would say that, lithium has historically and still is like a smaller extractive market compared to copper, let alone oil.
Yeah.
Just like a decade ago or a couple decades ago, actually, a lot of lithium was mainly used for like the sort of personal electronics revolution, right? Like the lithium batteries in our cell phones and things like that. And that was big. But much bigger is like the EV market, right? Which is really more taken off in the past, 10, 15 years, especially in China. And so it started as a small market. It's growing at a very rapid clip and actually needs to grow the most of really any of the critical markets, just in terms of scale. And what's that meant is that for many years, it's been a sort of oligopolistic market with like 4 or 5 main companies that are Australian, Chilean, Chinese in terms of their origin, right? In terms of where they're headquartered. But now we see, to your point, you said Glencore, right? Like we see Glencore, we see Rio Tinto, we see the big commodity trade. Some of them are also commodity traders, and they're also like, just mega mining companies. We see them moving in. We see the oil companies moving in, right? So, and then we also see lots of what's called like junior companies that have a big role in lithium, in particular with like doing early stage exploration. And so those are like very low capitalized companies that take on this risk with the hope of selling kind of what they find in a way to some bigger company, right? So it's in an interesting inflection point where I think we're definitely seeing like the big recognizable, like kind of name brand mining companies moving in, but also like Exxon. And so we'll kind of see how that shapes out in like 5 or 10 years from now.
Yeah, it's interesting, like, because I was just wondering, like, are there any like mining startups? Like, do they have the same kind of affinity as, all these tech companies we hear about?
Absolutely. And actually, even because of the weirdness with lithium that I was saying, that it's like has all these heterogeneous deposits and you need really specific extractive techniques for it, but also because lithium, of course, is tied to the energy transition. So for better or worse, there's like a sort of, this attempt to like do green branding with it. And I say for better or worse, because I think sometimes that can open leverage for environmental activists to say, like, you say you're going to extract this in a green way and you don't, but also there's a lot of greenwashing, and that's mainly probably what it is. But just to say that, like, there are these proposals, and they come in part actually literally from the tech world in the US, like the sort of Silicon Valley world, to mine lithium in ways that are less environmentally harmful because they use kind of chemistry to filter the lithium out of brine or geothermal deposits, right? And so still needs full proof of concept because it's really just at a pilot phase. But the Vulcan project in Germany, the Salton Sea project in the US, I don't know if Cornwall was maybe going to use some of these methods too. But anyway, the direct lithium extraction, it's called. So you do have these like disruptive innovations, to use that Silicon Valley language, but they're not fully evidenced yet that they can extract without harm.
This is where like the venture capital, kind of the new age venture capital, is finding its way into mining.
Yes, it's literally venture capital that is funding some of these like DLE experiments. And I'm not trying to be like, if we can find a way to extract lithium and like not harm watersheds, like great. I'm not trying to just be like cynical for the sake of it. It's just that we haven't seen this proven yet. And I also just in general believe that nothing is cost-free environmentally. And like, I won't get into it because it's beyond our discussion, but there are environmental impacts even at the test phase of some of these like newer methods, right? So again, I think the search for like the perfect extraction technique is like, a wild goose chase or whatever. Like it's more about, as I said earlier, like harm reduction, better governance, rights enforcement. Like it's those basic political economy pieces and power relation pieces that are very necessary to produce better outcomes.
So is that where our hope lies? Because I mean, you're sort of describing the inexorable march of kind of green capitalism. I think in a lot of what you've just talked about, which in lots of ways feels incompatible with a kind of the fundamental change we might need to address the climate crisis. So where are the and if we can end on
a
hopeful note, we'll do it.
Where are the resources of hope here? What are the avenues that we might want to sort of amplify or think about in terms of not kind of just replicating the same old,
Where,
in
where
a
are
kind
the
of
hope
green
deposits,
overcoat.
Theo?
Yeah, gotta mine hope. Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think it's a good moment to talk about it. And I was even, thinking that another kind of technological fix, but one that I think is more robust than just like finding the perfect extractive technique is recycling and materials recovery, right? Which is like, again, that kind of circular economy approach where everything, as much as possible, our waste should cycle back into the system as a kind of input, right? And batteries are perfectly recyclable. The materials within them, including lithium, can be recovered at very high rates, and they, should be already battery quality and they're great. And so that's actually that could be hopeful. And the European Union is legislating and requiring increasing percentages of battery content to be from recycled materials, right? And that's good, right? That's like a place where, regulating green capitalism to kind of channel it to more socially useful activity. Like, again, I think that those are positive things, but there, again, the question of power of like this, if a state's going to require battery makers, they have to have like leverage and be able to enforce. And so all of those still tricky questions of politics come in. But, I guess this will be my opportunity to bring up a report that I worked on, which for me is quite helpful in a number of ways. For me, this report that I worked on with a bunch of collaborators was very helpful. And I actually want to take us a little full circle to where this interview started. And you asked me, how I got into this type of work. And, as soon as I started to feel literally kind of torn apart from some of these tensions of like mining related harm, yet the necessity of an urgent energy transition, which is going to require some mining, right? Like as soon as I found myself in that position, I started to think like, what version of the energy transition requires the least mining and still meets our climate goals? Like that seems like a reasonable question for like someone with an environmental conscience and the climate commitment to kind of ask. And I applied this specifically to what I was working on, which was electric vehicle supply chains. And so like, I started to think and consult the internet, like, if we do more buses or e-bikes instead of like e-buses or e-bikes instead of EVs, like, do we get into a better position with lithium mining? Because an e-bus serves many people. Yes, the battery's bigger because it's like a bigger vehicle, but it might cycle through 1,000 passengers in an hour. And like an e-bike has a tiny battery, like much smaller than a car, right? So in different ways, they're better than cars, right? And I would Google blah, blah, and like there was nothing, meaning there was no research I could find. And I used all the keywords like to just like, are there different levels of lithium demand depending on how we design our transportation systems? And it actually spoke volumes to me, like the silence speaks volumes, like that phrase, like that the lack of that question being asked in the social scientific and scientific literature was like, why has no one asked this, right? I can't be, I'm like not a genius. Like, I mean, meaning like, I'm just confronting the obvious reality and this question emerges. So years go by. I first thought about this in like early 2019 when I was doing the research in the Atacama Desert in Chile. And then I finally, find myself in a sort of think tank environment where I can produce reports collaboratively because I don't have the quantitative skills that question would require. Mm-hmm. And so I worked with a team of people and we discovered that the answer is yes, meaning like depending on how you design the transportation system, as well as other questions of land use and density and sprawl and all these other things that we don't even think about when we think about lithium mining, dramatically different quantities of lithium would be needed. So that's hopeful, meaning like we can meet our climate goals and do it with less mining and still have actually widespread mass, affordable, clean mobility, right? Which is a human right. I mean, meaning I think mobility is a human right. And like, it's some, so there's like also a class dimension in terms of access to clean ways to get around, since poor people are affected the most by polluting vehicles in all sorts of ways, right? And so, it is a trilemma in a certain sense, like, these different goals, but I think that like, if you think about them in tandem, there are ways to like maximize benefit and reduce harm. And, I guess one other thing that's hopeful on that front is that at least in the US, I'm not sure it's the case in the UK, I don't think you'd get as dramatic a difference because the US is uniquely car obsessed, right? So like what's interesting
we're
is like,
trying.
I know. I almost caught myself. But I think in like terms of vehicle ownership rates and it being like a requirement to be a member of society, the US is like out there in its own stratosphere. But what's interesting is that people a little in my generation, but much more the like Gen Z below me, I'm like an old millennial. Anyways, like so the people that are like my students' age, right? They are less interested in owning cars. They also own cars less, like at a lower rate. And that is like the first time that we've seen this generational shift. Because like older generations, like professed like, I want a car, and like once they got the financial opportunity, they bought one, right?
Yeah.
And so we're finally seeing, and if you ask Gen Z people why, there's two reasons, and they're both very valid. One has to do, of course, with the cost of living crisis, and especially with the high interest rates now, cars are really unaffordable for even like middle class people. Like it's almost more than your rent, like the monthly payment on a car, right? So there's that piece, but there's also, yeah, it's crazy. That's another question, but there's also they're environmentally conscious, and they associate cars with the climate crisis because of the, you know, obviously gasoline and the emissions, but even EVs, there's like a general awareness that like they involve some mining and they might create some harm, right? So point being, they want to live in cities with buses and bike paths and walkable streets, right? And that is positive to me because we've seen a lot of generational change in politics in the US having an impact, like on a variety of issues that we could get into, racial justice, reproductive rights, like, and you know, not to say that what the people want is always what happens. That's definitely not the case, and not right now, and on a variety of very important issues around the world. But regardless, I do think at least it's a start. If you're starting with constituencies that are open to sort of non-car lifestyles, like it does make that campaigning and organizing a little bit easier. So I guess, you know, just to end this out, like I think that there's a lot of hopeful things in the landscapes and communities affected by extraction, in the sense that I think those communities are very environmentally conscious. They're really savvy about their rights under international law and norms. They're fighting to defend their land and water in ways that we didn't see a couple decades ago. So that's inspiring. But they also face a huge amount of risk, and I don't want to downplay that, and repression and violence when they do so. And then I'm kind of at the other end of the supply chain, you know, we have this concerning stuff around the continuity of kind of auto mobility as like the solution to the climate crisis with EVs. But we also, I think, see a lot of openings for different types of transportation futures. And that, I think, is something that we should explore as climate activists more.
In A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal, there's a chapter about developing a new internationalism, which I think we've kind of talked a little bit, we've talked around about that in terms of talking about South America and the developments in the USA as well. Can you maybe talk to that a little bit and kind of express how this is developing and how it's interacting with the kind of rare earth mineral sector?
Yeah. Well, there's actually, so we did call for that in A Planet to Win, and it pertained to the chapter, especially on lithium, and thinking about how, you know, lithium invites us to think, lithium and these other extractive sectors invite us to think about what a global Green New Deal would look like, and also applying Green New Deal principles to supply chains themselves from start to finish. And so we were kind of being sketchy, meaning we were like, this is an idea we have, right? But it was like a kind of future oriented proposition, and we didn't know how things were going to play out. We were writing this in 2019 at a sort of earlier stage of the energy transition. And what I couldn't have known then, but do know now because history has unfolded since, is that one form this internationalism, has taken is that partly because like global North governments, so this includes, so I mentioned Cornwall a few times just again because you're in the UK and that's like a local reference, but in the US as well, we see a lot of like government support and corporate support, of course, for like mining lithium within the US, and similar, and I did research in Portugal, and similar in Spain and Portugal. There's a lot of lithium projects, and we could go around the world, and Canada. The reason I'm naming these places is, as different as they are, they're all kind of categorized as like part of the global North, right? And so it challenges us a little bit to think like, you know, on the one hand, I think that the energy transition in terms of its extractive foundations is like more of the same, meaning extraction in the global South, harm being offshored. But there's also the simultaneous other thing happening, which is a little hard to grapple with, which is global North policymakers, partly because of competition or even kind of new Cold War dynamics with China, are saying, we actually want to mine this stuff domestically so that we have security, right? And then you're kind of, you know, communities within the global North are the ones in those cases that are like bearing the harms, right? And does that, you know, is that good? I'm putting this in scare quotes. I know this is a audio podcast, but just so people know, like, is that good because we kind of redistribute the harms of mining, and the global North kind of doesn't just like take the good stuff and put the bad stuff elsewhere, but kind of deal with the consequences of its own consumption? One could make that argument, except then you kind of get into it and you're like, wait, the communities that are being affected by mining in the US, for example, or Canada, you know, or these other countries I've named, are like actually not the communities that are like the ones that are getting the EVs. Like they are like marginalized, peripheral, they're peripheries within the center, right? And that's a real thing because spatial inequality is kind of all the way down. It's not just like these two major categories of global north and south. As we know, as denizens of the global north, there's extreme levels of class and race inequality in the US, like a settler colony, like of repression of indigenous peoples, right? And so, you know, I think we have to get more complex about how, you know, we think about where these extractive sectors are sited, not assume that them just coming into the global north is per se a good thing. On the other hand, we obviously do need to make the siting of extractive activities and the harm like more equal. And so like, what does that mean? But this was a huge preamble to just say that one of the forms of internationalism that I wouldn't have predicted is because of all of this growth of these critical mineral kind of projects in the global north, we have communities resisting them in the global north. And they are like in conversation with communities in the global south in a new way. So there's this kind of horizontal from below kind of internationalism with communities that are all across the world, but share that they're being affected by an onslaught of new mining, right? And so that's one type of thing happening. You know, the other things, and this is something we've been working on in Climate and Community Project, is thinking through, and not to like say that we're the central protagonist, but we're just like one group that is thinking through how to convene and even just have in the same meeting room like groups across the supply chain. Like what would it look like? And we've been sort of starting to do this work to have auto workers meet with, you know, indigenous anti-mining activists, to meet with transit riders unions, to meet with recycling advocates, like, and we've been starting to convene kind of meetings that involve groups that some of which have really never talked or even thought about one another very much, but what they have in common. So it's less the horizontal, and it's more looking at the supply chain from end to end. What they have in common is that they are situated across the supply chain, and that they're like a grassroots constituency that may not be like right now kind of directing that transition, but with coalitions and with kind of using their leverage where they have it, like could actually reshape the transition in a different way. So that's like a bit more aspirational, but I think another form of not just internationalism, but like, I mean, that too, but also even within the same country, it could be like coalition building between these disparate groups and communities.
I think almost an example of that is what's happening in Norway right now against Tesla, where there is the strikes happening at the Tesla plants, which apparently Norway, I think is it Norway, is one of the biggest like buyers of Tesla cars anyway. And there's solidarity strikes basically all around electric vehicles in the country. So you can't even get a license plate for an electric vehicle because their DVLA will not do it.
I've been reading about this. Like, it's really interesting.
I'm not involved. Yeah, you know.
And it's like spreading. Like they're like spreading. There's like solidarity strikes and things like that happening. Yeah, super interesting.
Well, we'll have to get on to some Norwegian organizers to find out how it kind of developed. But I think we should probably leave it there. Yeah.
For sure.
That's a good place to end it. You know.
Okay.
Saying something like, you know, you've got nothing to lose, but
EVs. Nothing to lose but supply chains. There we go.
I know. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Amazing. Thanks so much. You've been such a fantastic guest, Thea. Really, like, brilliant.
No problem.
To talk
Thank
to you. So we've now reached the end of the show and the point at which we ask our guests to shout out to any people or organisations that are doing their bit for the climate movement, or indeed for any important movement today. So who would you like to give a shout out to, Thea?
So I'm glad that you do this, because I do like lifting up the work of groups everywhere that are doing these critical campaigns and organizing. And I'm going to sort of continue with the theme of internationalism, I guess, that this was not a planned coincidence, but it does pertain to that. I was recently listening to Democracy Now!, which is like a US kind of lefty, but really just essential kind of daily newscast on video and audio. And they were reporting live from COP28. And they reported on, so COP28 is not the inspiring thing. I won't, that's just spoiler alert.
That's a really.
But things can happen at bad meetings that are inspiring, which is that there were it's almost just how they organized this, given the repressive context of where the COP28 is, and just in general, even when the COP28 is happening in a so-called democracy. There's a huge amount of security and repression of the ability of activists to kind of use that venue. But anyway, despite all of that, they organized like a Palestinian solidarity kind of set of speeches, kind of vigil type thing that was very moving. And I just want to say, because he happens to be UK based and the organization is UK based, that I was really just moved by Asad Rehman's speech at that, and just the work of War on Want, and like being very consistent about connecting internationalism, climate justice, and just like not giving in to any kind of attempts to divide those issues or to, and just being intersectional in the way they organize, and seeing the connections between climate justice and the climate injustice and environmental injustice and the genocide in Gaza. So I'm like, just want to lift up the work of Assad and the work of War on Want, and I've been privileged to work with them in some contexts, and they're just doing great stuff. So I'll use that as my example.
Amazing.
Yeah, Assad's a big friend of our podcast.
Oh, great.
So yeah,
great.
Yeah. I want to say thank you to everyone who's listening. And remember that if you're helping the planet in any way, we love you, we appreciate you, and we hope you'll join us again next time. Thank you.